All right, welcome back to CMMC Unlocked. Today we're diving into one of the most pressing questions on every defense contractor's mind. How long does this journey really take? And what are you honestly going to spend on CMMC or NIST SP 800-171 compliance? We're laying it all out, start to finish.
Yeah, and I have to say, Paul, maybe we should print t-shirts for all the listeners saying, I survived the CEMEMC compliance timeline. Because when you break it down, it's not a one-and-done affair.
No, not at all. I like to ground these discussions in something practical. The Critical Prism Defense whitepaper sets out 5 core phases for compliance. First, you've got to nail your scoping. Then comes the gap assessment, really a reality check on what you're missing. Third, a compliance crosswalk with whatever frameworks you already follow. Then, remediation, where the heavy lifting and spending usually happens. And finally, the formal assessment, whether that's self-attestation or a third-party C3PAO certifying you.
That lines up well with how federal rulemaking describes implementation. If you've looked through 32 CFR Part 170, or the new DFARS proposed rule, the DoD's following this phased approach. Scoping, identifying the assessment pathway, addressing POA&Ms, and ultimately, certification. And remember, the new requirements are phased in, so you could be facing self-attestation at level 1 or 2 this year, then a full-blown C3PAO review the next, depending on your contracts.
And Roz, you'll get a kick out of this. I had a small manufacturer approach us last year saying, hey, we think this is a 3-month sprint. We mapped out their data flows and user workflows, and after the initial gap assessment, it was clear they'd overlooked a lot. That 3-month guess ballooned into a 12-month marathon. Scoping and prep always take way more effort than most organizations plan for, and that's before you even get to remediation.
That's really what I'm seeing too. The earlier you properly identify those milestones, the more realistic your planning. Rushing the first phases almost always gets you into trouble later.
So let's drill into scope for a second, because it's not just a paperwork exercise. Scoping actually determines what technology, which business units, and honestly, how much this is all going to cost. If you get your scoping wrong, everything else, from timelines to budget, falls apart.
I want to pick up on something federal regs make explicit here. Section 170.19 in 32 CFR spells out the assessment scope for CEMEMC, right down to asset categories and business unit boundaries. And don't underestimate those flow-down requirements for primes and subs. The DFARS proposed rule makes it clear. A change in scope, even late in the process, means possibly having to rework your assessment boundary, not to mention budget and resource planning.
Right. And I've seen the cost swings firsthand. Let's talk micro, small, medium business examples. Critical Prism's numbers here are spot on. If you're a micro business with, say, 2 people spending 40 hours each on scoping at $200 an hour, that's about $8,000 just to figure out what's in and what's out. Scale that to a small business with 5 or 10 folks involved and more complex workflows. The scoping cost alone jumps to $40,000 or more. Medium businesses with enterprise-level shared resources could end up at $160,000 just on the scoping stage. These are real numbers.
And those costs don't even account for changes in contract requirements as new work comes in. You could scope something perfectly today, and tomorrow a new DoD contract adds a requirement for CUI processing in a different business unit, triggering a whole new assessment. As we discussed in earlier episodes, keeping contracts, scope, and flow-down requirements synced is a core compliance discipline now, especially with the latest guidance.
100%. The lesson? Get your scope right, upfront, and revisit it regularly. If your data flows and business units shift, your compliance model and costs are going to shift right along with them. Let's shift to assessments, Roz. What contractors need to get is that the gap assessment piece is wildly variable. You can do a $1,600 quick review for a micro business, but a deep dive policy review, document check, or a third-party mock audit can hit $12,800 or more, sometimes in just this phase. It all depends on what you need assessed and how far you've already come with your own controls and documentation.
Yep, And federally, the NIST and CMMC structure puts a lot of emphasis on this. The crosswalk process. Mapping your current standards like ISO 27001 or NIST SP 800-53 to CMMC can save you a ton of effort downstream, but only if your mapping is documented and independently reviewed. That's not just recommended, it's baked right into protocols, because assessors have to see clear, well-documented linkages for any controls you claim as already met.
Exactly. And here's where a lot of folks get bitten. We worked with a client who, honestly, they assumed their ISO 27001 documentation would carry over. Turns out, they skipped a proper crosswalk. When it came time for their CMMC prep, they had to spend an extra $8,000 remapping everything, not to mention weeks lost, because most policy docs didn't directly address the CMMC objectives. Don't treat the crosswalk as a checkbox. Invest the time and get independent eyes on your mapping if you want to control cost and prevent surprises.
Honestly, it's a recurring theme. Organizations that invest in thorough upfront crosswalks and gap analyses almost always get through remediation faster and with fewer budget overruns. Skip them, and the remediation phase becomes open-ended, not just in terms of money, but in delays and resource drag.
So let's be real about remediation. This is where the biggest uncertainty and sticker shock can hit. The Critical Prism whitepaper puts remediation costs at anywhere from $30,000 a year for microbusinesses to $300,000 for a medium business. And that doesn't even cover tech overhauls or unpredictable problems like replacing legacy servers. Some of those costs can recur annually, especially if you're keeping controls up to date or dealing with regular audits. Documentation and process maturity are the main pain points here.
It's worth hammering home. Federal estimates published with the 2024 DFARS rule and in the Federal Register assume that you're already substantially compliant with NIST 800-171. The model is recurring costs for maintaining and proving controls, not getting started from scratch. So initial remediation can be far higher in reality. But the government only expects you to charge them for the delta, what's new or what's tied to new contract requirements, after legacy obligations are met. Contractors aren't supposed to bill the government all over again for controls they were already required to have in place.
Right, and that's a real sticking point in the field. I see finance, contracts, and procurement folks scratching their heads on how to recover costs. There are several FAR and DFARS compliant methods: indirect cost allocations, direct billing with backup documentation, or direct charge labor categories for compliance analysts. Get contracts and procurement involved as early as possible. If you wait, you'll be eating those costs, or fighting about allowability after the fact. Plan for recurring cycle costs too, every 3 years, at the very least. Plus, hardware and software refreshes that don't conveniently line up with audit timelines.
It all comes down to documentation and traceability. If you want to recover costs, especially for new or changed requirements, you absolutely need to be able to justify why the changes are valid based on scope shifts and new contracts. Build cost recovery into every compliance and remediation plan. And don't forget the operational expense cycles.
Wrapping it up, let's talk about what the official estimates actually say. According to the latest numbers from DFARS Case 2019 D041 and the CMMC Program Rule, annual Level 1 self-assessment and affirmation is pegged at about $6,000 for a small entity and even less for larger ones just doing Level 1. But once you get into Level 2 territory, a self-assessment costs over $37,000 for small entities, nearly $49,000 for large. And if you have to go through a full C3PAO Level 2 certification, that can top $100,000, not even counting your own prep.
At Level 3, it gets even more dramatic. Recurring engineering costs for small orgs are close to $500,000. Non-recurring can be in the millions, especially when you factor in the 800-172 enhanced requirements. What's key in the DFARS and 32 CFR is that federal guidance expects contractors to be compliant with legacy requirements already. They only want to reimburse new scope or higher-level control costs. So, if you're thinking you'll recoup that entire multi-year remediation overhaul, read the fine print first. Incremental, not total, is the rule of the game now.
Let's walk through a real-world cost timeline using the Critical Prism whitepaper's planning model. Take your scoping, $8,000 to $40,000. Add in gap analysis or crosswalk, $8,000 to $16,000. Tack on remediation and pre-audit prep, $30,000 to $60,000 for smalls. Then look at an actual assessment, $35,000 to $85,000. Recurring assessment costs every 3 years, cyclical remediation, and ongoing updates. It compounds, sometimes dramatically, if your scope or contract requirements change mid-cycle. And that's not accounting for discovery of undocumented assets halfway in, which, believe me, happens more than anyone likes to admit.
That's a great point. The official numbers always look neat in a policy document, but in reality, especially for supply chain contractors or subs, timelines stretch out due to discovery, remediation, and documentation phases. I'd say build plenty of slack into your planning models. And don't forget to carve out resources for continuous compliance, not just point-in-time assessments.
Absolutely. And if you missed it in a previous episode, that's where the real cost surprises happen. All right, Roz, this was a marathon, but I think we gave the folks some real transparency on what compliance really looks like, end to end.
Yeah, we've hit a lot of ground here. And remember, for listeners, leave us your questions and war stories. What tripped you up on your compliance journey or wrecked your cost assumptions? We want to tackle those in a future episode.
Thanks as always, Roz. We'll catch everyone soon on another deep dive. This is CEMMC Unlocked, signing off. Take care.
See you next time, Paul. Bye for now, everyone.